Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett announcing brand new and renewed coronavirus restrictions amidst the latest bump in infections. Meanwhile, Israel reportedly pressured into a rare condemnation of a major trading partner, China. The fallout from such a decision still unknown. And finally, one step closer to an incredible sci-fi future. The Israel Defense Forces unveiling a laser with the ability to shoot down drones, rockets, and mortars. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett announcing renewed border clampdowns on Tuesday in coordination with the Israel Health Ministry. This as daily cases more than doubled to at least 125 earlier this week, and mostly, it seems, with the more infectious Delta variant from India.
זן הדלתא, שלפעמים קוראים לזה הזן ההודי, הזן הדלתא כרגע מתפשט באופן מואץ ברחבי העולם, בהרבה מאוד מדינות, עם קצב הדבקה הרבה יותר גבוה ממה שהכרנו. זאת אומרת, משהו שם מדבק בערך 50% יותר, ולצערי אנחנו רואים גם תחילת התפשטות בתוך מדינת ישראל.
Not quite yet a fourth wave, but cases of COVID-19 back on the rise in Israel. And over 40% of new cases the last month tracing to individuals who arrived infected from abroad. Prime Minister Bennett then again calling on Israelis to avoid international travel, while announcing a number of updates to the country's COVID response, including tightening of all ports of entry and immediately reestablishing the coronavirus cabinet. Additionally, masks will be mandatory in the airports at all times, with a nationwide indoor mask policy to follow pending changes to the infection rate. All individuals who enter Israel will need a negative PCR test, and the number of testing stands at the airport will be increased to reduce lines. Parents whose children break quarantine will face harsh fines in the closing of an enforcement loophole. And finally, a third of the population, mostly kids and adolescents, still unvaccinated and therefore holding the country back from real herd immunity. So Bennett repeating a plea for all aged 12 and up to vaccinate as soon as possible.
כל האינדיקציות המדעיות בישראל ובעולם מלמדות שהסכנה מהמחלה גבוהה לאין ארוך מהסיכון של החיסון.
And many already heeding the advice.
He had corona, so but still this is the variant, so it's something else, so we don't sure about it. I thought until yesterday that I'm not going to vaccine him at all, and now I'm not so sure about it.
כן, האמת שדי רציתי להתחסן, כי כבר התפרצות בבית הספר, וכבר בבית הספר שלי גם היה התפרצות, לפני כאילו חודש בערך.
718.
אז רציתי להתחסן כדי לא לקבל את המחלה.
211.
Yeah, we came to vaccinate Yoav for COVID-19. We do it in order to protect Yoav and the entire community.
All right, speaking of international relations, Israel joining some 41 other nations at the UN Human Rights Council on Tuesday in backing Canada, or a Canadian resolution on China. Canada's statements putting pressure on China to end its brutal campaign against Uyghur Muslims and other minorities.
Credible reports indicate that over 1 million people have been arbitrarily detained in Xinjiang, and that there's widespread surveillance disproportionately targeting Uyghurs and members of other minorities, and restrictions on fundamental freedoms and Uyghur culture. There are also reports of torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment, forced sterilization, sexual and gender-based violence, and forced separation of children from their parents by authorities.
Ambassador Norton then calling for China to immediately adopt UN recommendations for ending discrimination and detention of Chinese minorities, and to allow immediate, meaningful, and unfettered access to Xinjiang for both independent and UN observers. Israel's involvement in the action, however, while noble, is also very rare. Jerusalem typically trying not to antagonize major trading partners like China, but apparently bowing this time to pressures from the United States' Biden administration. Joining me now to expand on this deviation from the norms, Professor Mark Meirowitz, political analyst, American foreign policy expert, and professor at SUNY's Maritime College. Professor, thanks so much for being with us. Now, first off, just before Canada's statement, China ironically blasted Canada and called for an investigation into the recently discovered deaths of indigenous children in British Columbia in the late 1800s. And China's statement is backed by Russia, Belarus, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and Venezuela. Do you think that this is just China diverting attention, or is this representative of the alleged dysfunction at the UNHRC?
Well, first of all, Canada and China have had very difficult relations because Canada detained a Huawei executive on an extradition warrant from the United States. And in retaliation, China arrested two Canadians. They call them the two Michaels, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, and been holding them without charges. So Canada and China are not in a good situation. About the UNHCR, I think it's pretty ironic that the UNHCR and the UN, which has constantly criticized Israel, opening up investigations on Israel, now makes a statement and investigation in connection with China. So I think at this point, it's also a little bit ludicrous for Canada to be criticized for its indigenous treatment of indigenous people. It's very reminiscent of Putin when he lashes out at the United States for its history of racial injustice. I mean, it's hilarious. If you do something wrong, you point the finger at someone else and tell them they did something wrong, and that makes what you did right. I think my grandson is 5 years old. I think he learned this in school, that isn't true. You don't do that. You defend what you do, and if you're wrong, you're wrong.
All right, so will anything actually come of Canada's statement? Because, what sanctions or punitive actions can be passed that might sufficiently pressure China to change?
Pressuring China to change is an insurmountable and literally impossible function in the United Nations. Remember, the United Nations has a veto system, and China has a veto. It's one of what is called the permanent members of the Security Council. So taking action against China is not in the cards. But I think that this effort on the part of the Western nations and other nations like Canada and Israel and others to point attention to what China has been doing, not just in Xinjiang, but also Hong Kong was mentioned and Tibet was mentioned, I believe, in the UN. This is important because autocratic regimes like China cannot withstand criticism. We've seen that also with Russia. So again, maybe this will be helpful. As far as sanctions, I don't see those as being effective right now in dealing with China.
All right, now let's talk a little bit about Israel then. Israel has until now walked this tightrope when it came to issues between the United States and China, usually opting to just stay silent. What effect, if any, do you predict will come of this change in policy? Will trade with China suffer? Will China somehow punish Israel and other Canadian backers, or was it really just not that notable?
Look, Israel is taking the side of the Western nations, the United States and Canada. Keep in mind that China has a deal on the Belt and Road Initiative with Israel to build the Haifa port. Recently, actually, with U.S. pressure, Israel rejected a Chinese bid to build a desalination plant. So it's not just trade here that's at stake. It's also all of these interactions with China that are very important to Israel. So I think, yes, it will possibly have an effect. We've seen that China is very, very sensitive. Looking at Australia, for example, when Australia raised the issue of the coronavirus, China hammered them with tariffs and embargoes. So I'm not sure where this is going to go. Again, the publicity has not been focusing on Israel, it's been focusing on Canada. So maybe Israel can be a minor party in this and side with the Western powers and maybe go forward with its relationship with China unaffected, but we don't know.
All right, Professor Mark Meirowitz, thank you so much.
Thank you.
In other news, the United States taking a new approach with Iran by ordering a major crackdown against Iran-linked media organizations. Washington seizing dozens of different web domains, including those of Iran's Islamic Radio, Press TV, Al-Alam, and the Yemen-based Al-Masirah TV channels. The Justice Department explaining that at least 33 of the Iran-backed sites that were closed had long been used to sow disinformation and discord among the American public, and that several other sites included were used by terrorist organizations. Meanwhile, as seen in screenshots from the various shuttered web pages, D.C. citing its sanctions law for the ability to close these sites. So, what happens next? Returning with answers, we're again joined by political analyst, American foreign policy expert, and professor at SUNY's Maritime College, Professor Mark Meirowitz. Professor, thanks for joining us again. Now, the Anti-Defamation League is lauding the seizures, saying Press TV, for one, is a leading dispenser of conspiratorial anti-Semitism. How deeply have these sites affected public discourse in America and discord among Americans?
Well, look, what the Iranians have done, and similar with the Russians and others, is a disinformation campaign. We call this in the literature sharp power. What do we mean? That the effort to, interfere with American thinking, American media, and sow concern and discord in the United States. Now, these websites are controlled by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, so therefore they're under sanction already. They're on the list of sanctionable and terrorist organizations. So this was the basis on which the United States closed these sites. But I would want to mention the point that the United States and other Western powers have closed similar sites before. For example, Fars, which was a .com, was closed, and then it simply picked up an Iranian domain name and continued to operate. One commentator called this whack-a-mole. In other words, we close a few sites and then they open up some other sites. But at the same time, I think it's important that the United States took this action in order to stop this activity. And yes, it's meant to sow disinformation, of course. And why should we allow it? Why should the United States allow Iran to sow in disinformation? I think it was a good step.
All right, so why only now? The United States has had the ability, as you said, to kill these pages for a long time, given that they're hosted on American servers. So why only now?
Well, I think a couple timing factors. Number one, the Iranian agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency, I believe, expires, has to be renewed on Thursday. And similarly, we just had an election in Iran where this Ebraizi, the butcher of Iran, or whatever he's called, this hardliner, has been elected. And now the question is, can they get the Iran nuclear deal done by August when Rouhani is still in power and can still effectuate a deal? So I think there are a couple of these timing factors that may have been, as you say, they could have done this any time, but maybe they're doing it to put pressure on Iran. But again, it's a funny chessboard, right? The United States negotiating indirectly, because it can't sit in a room with Iran. Iran won't sit in the room with the United States, can you imagine, in Geneva. And at the same time, we have these actions and sanctions and all sorts of things going on. So it looks like a very crazy quilt of diplomacy. So hard to understand, but maybe this is the timing in terms of some of these other factors that are going on.
All right, so how will this affect the JCPOA negotiations and maybe even the region as a whole?
You know, it's hard to know. I mean, in other words, if the Iranian websites can be then re-upped in another scenario with an Iranian domain name, then this becomes more a, let's say, symbolic effort. But having the .com is very significant, I think, in terms of having credibility. Now, at the same time, what I wanted to say about the disinformation, which is, I think, important, is that, look, why in the world would the United States and Western powers allow Iranian websites to operate in the first place? It reminds me of Lenin's adage. I think it was Lenin who said that the capitalist will give us the rope to hang themselves with. I mean, why would we allow them access? The same thing with RT. And maybe this is a message also to RT, the Russian websites and other websites that are sowing disinformation in the West and the United States, that, you better stop this activity or you're going to end up like these. But I don't know if it's directly connected, to answer your question, to JCPOA, but in politics, everything is connected. So obviously, it's a step the United States is taking against Iran at the same time as it is negotiating. It's very hard to know. And I think it is the timing. Again, just to go back what I said before, I think it is the timing and the momentum of the deal. And the United States is insistent on doing this deal. That's another subject for another day, why the United States is insistent on this, but they are. So here was something in our toolbox that the United States could use against Iran, maybe to show them that, we can flex our muscle against you, and we can do more things against you. So you need to to work with us towards this Iranian deal, the JCPOA. Very hard to understand.
All right, Professor Mark Mirowitz, thank you again so much. Moving on, the future is here. Israeli Defense Force officials confirming the success of a plane-mounted prototype that can shoot down drones with a high-powered laser beam. And there's much, much more to come. During recent tests over the Mediterranean Sea, the aerial laser system developed in partnership with Elbit Systems successfully shot down several UAVs from within a range of 1 kilometer, or just over half a mile away. And Israel says that within just a few years, they hope to have a more robust ground-based system capable of intercepting rockets, mortars, and drones from a much longer range of about 20 kilometers or 12 miles. Then once deployed, such a system could be set up alongside Israel's existing missile defenses as a much, much cheaper supplement. Because as long as there's electricity and a clear enough sky, the laser can be fired accurately and indefinitely. Each Iron Dome missile, by comparison, costing tens of thousands of dollars, but would still be used where the laser falls short. Now, on to some economy-focused news. Israel's central bank confirming that it has already issued and pilot-tested a digital shekel currency. But the Bank of Israel Deputy Governor Andrew Abir warning that the chance of truly rolling out a viable digital shekel still less than 50%. And now many others are losing faith as well following the recent crash in crypto markets. Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and Ethereum among the many, recently losing billions of dollars in value. So joining us with insights is economic consumer behavior expert and assistant professor Vili Abraham. Vili, thank you so much for being with us. I'm happy to finally see you in person.
Me too, finally to be here.
Yeah. All right, so why is Israel pursuing this digital shekel cryptocurrency or digital currency, and is the recent crash going to derail it?
Well, these are two different things. If you look at cryptocurrencies like the Bitcoin, there's no central bank that supervises it, okay? And if we're talking about the digital currency that the Bank of Israel is pursuing, that's going to be centralized. There's going to be supervision. And there are many reasons why it's pursuing it. First of all, because of Corona, we get a push, with the digital wallets and the contactless payments. So this gave a push to the technology, to the infrastructure. And there are a lot of reasons why you do it. First of all, it will help the government combat the black market. It's losing billions of shekels a year from lost income tax, and this is how you'll be able to supervise, because if we make a transaction, the government will know that I or you did a transaction. The other thing is that printing bills is very expensive. I don't know if our audience knows, but to print a 20 shekel bill or a dollar bill costs more than $1. It's really, really expensive.
I knew that about the penny, and I knew that about the agora, the smallest.
Yeah, they're expensive, and of course it makes transactions a lot more efficient. You can transfer money to anywhere in the world in just a few seconds. So a host of benefits.
So we talked about some of the benefits. What are some of the cons, maybe, from the perspective of both the government and private individuals of rolling this out?
Okay, so I don't see any downside as far as the government is concerned, but as far as we're concerned, there are downsides, because it means that people, especially the government, will be doing what we're buying, when we're buying. And this is especially problematic in
So it's a privacy issue.
It's a privacy issue. China is pursuing it for the reason because they want to know what their citizens are doing. And by the way, China and Russia are pursuing a cryptocurrency, a digital coin, because they want to somehow circumvent the sanctions that were imposed by the U.S. So it means that people who were sanctioned will be able to buy and sell things without the U.S. government knowing about it.
I see. All right. Now, I understand that actually you just wrote a piece about this very recently, about how Israel is not just piloting its own digital shekel, but actually using Ethereum to some degree. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so it's piloting a program. This was published really about 2 hours ago. And it's doing it only among workers in the Bank of Israel. And it's based on Ethereum, which is a blockchain technology, which is the major rival of Bitcoin. And it's doing it probably because it's really pushing to have this digital coin. Again, I think this will help the government, fill its coffers with a lot of money. You know that today we cannot make any transactions with cash if you buy something.
Because of COVID, really.
No, and because you're not allowed to. Because if you go to a store, you cannot pay more than 50,000 shekels in cash, because the government wants to, decrease the money that is circulating and not being taxed in the black market.
All right. Well, so we have a very interesting future to track when it comes to cryptocurrencies and digital currencies.
No doubt about it.
No doubt about it. Vili, thank you so much for being here with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, now we've all heard of toxic relationships, but it turns out that even unhappy relationships can be fatal long-term. A terrifying new report released by Israeli researchers at Tel Aviv University concluding that misery in marriage is a health risk factor on par with smoking or never working out. And in fact, in men specifically, such unhappiness has now been linked to a nearly 20% higher risk of death and a 69% increase in the likelihood of dying from a stroke. So what's the secret? Not just to not dying earlier, but to a healthier relationship overall. Practicing psychologist Dr. Camila Forkash-Levan joins us with the answers. Camila, thank you so much for being with us. Now, first off, are you surprised at all by this study's findings?
Well, actually, no. I would love to also see the results of a developed study also for the women. I'm sure we'll be also very surprised on the data as well. Right now, it was focused on the men, but I'd be very curious to see for the women as well. But no, I'm not surprised at all. I see this in everyday work. And one of the reasons why I choose to work with families and systems and drag in the other half of whoever comes to me is exactly for this, because the stressor is really, really high of whatever is happening at home on everything else.
All right, so in your own practice, I mean, have you seen a correlation between poor health and bad marriages? Do husbands get sick more often?
So the question is a little bit broader, I think. Also, this is a start, but I think the question is a little bit also broader because we don't know if people that in general have poor coping skills, yes, will also have then poor coping skills in their marriage, in the ability to form closer, healthier relationships, to cope with different kinds of stress, like finances, children. Something simple, maybe like making a dinner, might end up being a huge argument in a situation where one or both partners are not able to cope in a healthy way. That brings us to what do we do about this? And as far as I'm concerned, we should have on a social scale different kinds of things happening already starting from the kindergarten, like emotional regulation, like conflict resolution. How do you argue? How do you create those relationships? How do you resolve different conflicts? How do you deal with yourself and how you view the world? Because how you view things has a lot to do on how you will experience.
All right, so the authors of the study say that the solution essentially lies in couples therapy. But for everyone who maybe wants to prevent having to go to therapy in the first place, what are your biggest tips to maintaining a healthy relationship?
Right. So those kinds of things, it always starts from yourself, right? Like what can you do in order to be a healthy, functional individual, adult, child, whatever, yes? So children don't have as much yet over choice, yes? So it usually was presented to them. But as an adult, like if you see that relationships aren't working out for you, if you feel threatened often, or if you feel like, okay, no matter, I'm getting fired, you see you're getting fired from jobs, or there's a lot of conflict around you, do reach out to somebody, because maybe there's something that you can change within you, the way you view the world, how you interact with the world, that will literally en route change your experience, yes, and what is happening with you. Communication one-on-one, literally. How you communicate with a person, with someone next to you. It's not just the words that you use. Often the words will actually confuse us. Is the body language, the intonation, the look, your history will affect it. It affects obviously how not only how you view the situation right now, also what you're expecting for the future, and back on how it's affecting the situation in the right now. So always start with yourself, and then of course couples therapy, family therapy. I'm a huge proponent. It puts also individual therapy, depends on how it's done, yes, but it puts individual therapy basically on steroids. It's a beautiful thing, really.
All right. Camila Forkash-Levan, Dr. Levan, thank you so much for being with us again.
Thank you.
All right, now let's take a look at the weather forecast with Chana Rifkin.
Now, tonight and tomorrow, we're not seeing much different than yesterday's forecast, though clouds are clearing up. Lows this evening staying between 16 to 24 degrees Celsius, depending on the location. And tomorrow, temperatures rising just a bit in some areas, up out of the 20s and into the 30s. Now back to the studio with Aaron.
That is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.25 shekels to the American dollar and 2.65 shekels to the Canadian dollar. And finally, for the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channels, as well as to our newsletter at iltv.tv. I'm Aaron Porras. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.